Middle Business Economic Development update. And I'll turn my microphone on so you can hear me. We'll call this meeting order with the joint bill
where they'll come up with their number, you review that, and then have discussions. Could you just walk us through, if there's a conflict, how you resolve that? What is the process for that, please?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if we have a bond come in and let's say we're off by for easy math here, $20 million. We'll go back and to the company and outline where we feel that number is different. And then the company can develop data that would support their case to bring that back to us, that their number may be more accurate. The best example I can give you, though, is we had one of the companies very recently that came in, and we went back to them and said, we think you have more of a reduction. And where it was the centroids, where your dirt movement is from to where it's going to be placed. There's a line, and you use it's called a centroid, go center to center. We felt there was a better haul route or more efficient movement of that material. We went back to the company and suggested that they reevaluate those centroids and their dirt movement, and it did result in about at the end about a $12 million savings to that company. So the difference in the numbers isn't always raising it. Sometimes it is lowering it.
I think there's a question down here, but they're still formulating it.
Or they're just looking at their phone.
Or they're just reading some fun stuff.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I just got a message from one of our committee members that we may have been dead for the last 15, 20 minutes and that we weren't streaming. So that's what I,
Oh, not
Maybe.
streaming.
Sun will come up tomorrow.
Oh, my golly.
The sun will come up.
Have to
tomorrow.
start the whole day over. Oh, my gosh. Do we know anything about that? On the staff?
We're not gonna
Brian,
listen to
are
it.
we okay? Yeah, okay. All right, go ahead, Kyle.
I think it was back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, okay. So do we have any public comment on bonding guidelines? Public comment on bonding guidelines. Oh, yes, sir. Come right up here and use the microphone, please.
Maybe have you guys just step back a little.
Yeah, well, step back.
They're new.
Please identify yourself.
Good morning, Keith Williams with Arch Resources. I'm the president of Western Operations.
Keith, can we have you, if you would push your microphone, so that turns green in front of you? There you go.
Okay.
Thank you.
Keith Williams with Arch Resources. I'm president of Western Operations. That includes the Arch of Wyoming mine that we've just reclaimed here in the southern part of the state. We have Black Thunder mine and the Coal Creek mine in Campbell County. And then we run a mine also in Colorado, West Elk Underground Mine. This is Jamie Torski Olson with me. She's our environmental manager, and so she could probably help a lot on the comments or questions if I get any asked. Good to go ahead with comments then?
Yep.
Guideline 12 is, I would say, generally well received in the industry. We've worked through it. Mr. Windland's right. He's worked with us in a lot of the areas on the shovel share. That was much appreciated. On the getting to use a used shovel, that was much appreciated. So we have had some back and forth and some workarounds in this. We just still have issues with how we do the cost portion. And so there's a lot of data that they use, and our argument would be that we, have existing productivity, which he stated they use in some portions of the Guideline 12, but we would also like to consider using our cost in the Guideline 12. We do an ARO cost that we have to put on our balance sheet. We're a publicly traded corporation. That has to go in front of the SEC. We have to do 10K, 10Q reports All that's publicly listed. We have to sign off on all that. All that's audited by a third party. And so it takes our actual data over a 2.5-year period and figures out the average cost. So, you know, when it talks about using the models and the modeling to do this, that is correct. We do all that, but then when it comes to the cost portion, we leave a lot of that out and take a lot of guideline 12 for that. And so guideline 12, you have an area bond, which is the big portion of filling the hole that he talked about, which Senator Anderson, that's where they need the shovel to backfill the existing hole. Then you have some incremental areas, and then there's a lot of contingencies. And so I'd probably do a lot better to let Jamie talk, but I'll just give a couple of examples. On the area bond, in our most recent submittal, there was about a 20% difference in our actual costs that we incur in actuality with our own productivity and our own machines. It was that much higher than the guideline 12 specified. And then you get into the incremental pieces, and then you get into the contingencies. For an example, the Arch of Wyoming properties that we just completely reclaimed, we've actually given up jurisdiction on Medicine Bow, one of the permits, and we're close to giving up jurisdiction on the other 3. So that mine's been opened, operated over a 30-year period, and then we've come back and totally reclaimed that property. It's all around the Hannah area, and that mine's been totally reclaimed. We had $8 million on bond 2 or 3 years ago. For us to clean up those $8 million worth of contingencies probably cost us $100,000. And so there's just some areas, as they've been very receptive to working on some areas, there's some areas that we still think there's a lot of room to give on the bonding process. We now have to go out, nobody's self-bonded anymore, we now have to go out and get surety bonds. And so we pay a premium, and we spend a lot of money just going out and getting the bonds to hold to do the work we're doing. So, you know, most of what Mr. Windland said I would strongly agree with. There's just a few things we think that can still be worked on in that regard. I'll let Jamie talk about some of the details.
I think I'm live. Is that good?
Good.
All right. You know, as Keith alluded to, I think it's a complex situation, you know, the bond calculation.
Go ahead and give us your name for the
Oh,
record.
excuse me, Mr. Chairman. Jamie Torsky Olson, again with Arch Resources, Environmental Manager. Just like Keith said, between all the Arch properties. So again, you know, it's a complex issue. Certainly we appreciate that. And we appreciate the state's perspective on it as well, in anticipation of protecting the state. I think it's important also to consider that that bond should be there to incentivize the companies to do the work as well. The state doesn't want to do these projects. And I recognize there's sensitivities with SMACRA and the federal law as well that need to be recognized, certainly. But to speak to some of the details, Keith hit it pretty well on the head. You know, this last submittal, when we look at our costs versus, you know, for example, the guideline 12 costs, it was, you know, 20% less if you look at our numbers. There's still a significant spread, and that's what our concern is, certainly. And I think, you know, over the course of time, just like Mr. Wentland mentioned, guideline 12 has become the standard, and it would be important to try to give the state another mechanism as well that they can work with that would allow, you know, that cost structure, for example, or acceptance of some other third-party mechanism that would be completely independent, for example, that could potentially be a compromise and another way of looking at it. And I think some of the other troubles that we have, and it's all a risk spectrum, and when you look at the complexity of the problem or the, you know, calculation, it's a spectrum of risk. And, you know, you start adding conservatism on top of conservatism on top of conservatism, and it moves that pendulum to one side. Whereas probably reality, and that's the problem that the bond is, it's a thought project on how to best service and protect the state. And those what ifs can stack on top of one another, and it moves it far more conservative than probably what reality might end up. You know, on every project, there's probably ups and downs, there's pluses and minuses, and those things are negotiated along the way. They're large projects, it's over a course of time. You know, oftentimes these projects can be 5 to 10 years. And I guess so that's some of the big portions on the area bond. Some of the other equipment assumptions, there's a few other pieces of equipment that we'd like to see added or considered. A simple assumption, for example, blade pass width, and that goes back to CAT handbook, things like that. They can change the assumptions and those become additive over the course of multiple line items in the calculation. And that's what stacks on top of one another that we feel swings it to one direction. Stepping into the incremental bond side, obviously Keith talked about the area bond, that is the void that's filling the hole. The incremental bond is effectively topsoiling and reseeding and the reclamation work and holding that as also required by statute. When you step into that incremental bond, there's lots of assumptions on demolition, and I think that's going to probably come up as well later in conversation today. But at this point in time, there's no credit given, for example, for scrap steel. We basically have to dispose of everything, whereas, history in the Hanna Basin at least would indicate we at least got a check back from Pacific Steel, for example, for tearing down a lot of that equipment. Industrial sites, we've got other examples in the basin where, for example, track and infrastructure that has access to the main line and rail is actually a value. So while the bond exercise considers it, a burden or an expense, there's probably in reality some opportunity there with other industrial sites. And some of that, through the bonding process is tough to address during active mining and, ultimately can become a post-mine land use change. But, during the course of the bonding, oftentimes it needs to be considered to be taken out completely, and that's kind of how Guideline 12 right now approaches it. There's other, the reclamation status too is another, component of the incremental bond, and that's basically paying to watch the grass grow, which we know we have to prove up on. We're not trying to argue that fact at all. But for example, where statute somewhat misses it too is in that phase bond release of incremental bond release, for example. On phase 1 bond, 70 to 75% of your cost is in placement of the topsoil. So we go do a verification package and we get that phase 1 bond release, we get 60% back. So there's a portion of that in reality you will never touch again. The topsoil is down. So unless there's a huge reclamation failure, which at this point we have to bond for all of our acres, do you think that failure would be over the entirety of those acres or not? And history has shown that really we don't encounter many problems like that, where we would have to, for example, go back and take off topsoil and replace it. So over the course of history, 30 or 40 years of reclamation in the basin, we've demonstrated a huge success record where we believe some of those could be thought about differently. And, again, there's sensitivities to SMACRA in that area, but we believe there's some room to approach that differently as well. And then I'll step into kind of what we consider the last kind of component of the bond, which are the unknown costs and the contingencies. And so right now, the unknown costs are charged at a flat 5% of the bond cost. We feel that could be probably isolated more towards the volumetrics and towards the earth moving portion of that, which would be the area bond, and not necessarily applied to the incremental bonding. That would be a win on that component, and something that was logical as well. Mr. Wentland talked about redesign of a project, and that's where some of those uncertainties come into, and unknowns on material movement and how things swell and how the void fills and the actual functionality of the surface that you can leave behind. I'll step to the final kind of component, the contingencies. Basically, there's 7 different individual line items of contingency, and probably the largest component of that right now is the 13.5% item that is left for contractor profit, overhead, mobilization. We feel, and again, the guideline will give a range, and then LQD specifies within that range kind of what's accepted at this given time. And so right now, for example, the range in that category is 8 to 15%, and they're at 13.5%, for example. We believe that could be thought about a little bit differently as well. 13.5% for contractor profit is, for numbers that are probably already baked in. That's probably one of our largest issues in the contingency side. So, and again, you know, Keith mentioned it as well, but the used shovel conversation and work was important, and it was appreciated from industry. And that was something, again, it's logical. You know, there's going to be lots of equipment in the basin that's available. So ultimately, I think to kind of wrap this up, unless Keith's got anything else to say in addition to, it's a complex issue. It does provide some strain to the industry at this point, and especially the last couple years, we're trying to achieve those sureties before the market kind of switched this year. It was certainly a challenge. From my perspective as an employee of a company, I want a healthy employer, and I would think the state would want healthy operators as well. And I think it all ties together, that we can work together and ultimately, you know, service the solution, and that is to do the reclamation. So, Keith?
Jamie, you're thinking the 13.5% profit for the contractor is low? Should be 15? Oh, it's high?
Hi.
Oh,
And that would be included also, Senator Anderson, in our cost. So when we have our total cost in, that's our total cost, right? That's if we're making profit some years, maybe not making profit some years, that's already built in. And so, you know, we're taking a cost and we're adding a lot of different incremental contingencies in that we think are just part of our normal business and are already considered in our total cost.
questions? Questions for the presenters? Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Olson, was that correct? You mentioned some of these things that on your balance sheets are currently liabilities. Like you said, some of that scrap metal, you know, rail ties, some of that kind of stuff. Could you maybe give us an estimate in terms of the numbers? I mean, I assume it's significant enough where you are going to raise this as an issue. I mean, but could you maybe just elaborate in terms of how much that would be to quantifiably change some of these, some of the results in these calculations?
Yeah, I can speak to some kind of generalities. In our currently approved bond, for example, of our incremental component, we have about $12 million for demolition. Now, some of that is for wells and things like that that absolutely need to be plugged and abandoned. But the greatest majority of that is, and it's probably the single largest, other than the topsoil movement of the incremental bond, that's the next largest component of it. And there's really no credit given, for example, for making value out of existing structures. It's basically assumes tearing them down flat. So another example, the rail turnouts. So we have lots of track, obviously, to service the trains. You know, demolition at this point, I think in guideline 12 is close to $9 or $12 per linear foot. We believe it could be, number one, done much less than that, for example, and number two, potentially used in another industrial operation. Frac sand transloading, for example, would be an example. So percentage basis, I don't know necessarily that I have the numbers in front of me right now to answer that question, but it's the second largest component of our incremental bond.
Good. Representative Sherwood, did you have a question? No? Okay. Is there a question? Yes. Representative Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This question is probably for you, Mr. Williams, because you mentioned that you had an $8 million bond, area bond, I believe, and then your actual cost was $100,000 to reclaim that area. Is that an accurate statement?
That's an accurate statement, and that goes to Representative Weston's question also. That was at our Hannah operations, and so the $8 million, Jamie might know better than me, but that would include all the incremental pieces. It would also have included wrecking out the shop, the rail loadout, which at that place wasn't a concrete silo, it was a metal tipple, the office buildings, and then the reclamation of that entire area, and then some of the incremental issues with knocking that down. When we actually did all the demolition on that, there was a drag line sitting there also, a large drag line. We went to several different contractors. Pacific Steel got the bid, and at the end, they wrote us a $45,000, it may have been $43,000 check to pull all the steel off the property. And so not only did we not have to pay to demolish any of that, we actually got paid the scrap fee for them to come in and clean all that up. And so then we just had to come back in, grade the property where that had been, plant topsoil, seed it, and finish the rest of it out. And so, you know, that was a huge portion of it. And then all the other, what Jamie's talking about, is the contingencies. As the contingencies don't happen and those fall off, then it just goes away. And so that's part of our issue. Should we have contingencies? Yes, we think they're well overstated. And so, you know, our history has been we've not used any of them. So do we start ratcheting those back to the lower end of the guidelines more than the higher end of the guidelines?
Do it. So, as I remember, Medicine Bow Coal 50 years ago was a dragline operation. And did you use a shovel in that reclamation?
We use the drag line primarily in a lot of the areas to do the final pits, and then we use dozers in the other areas. And you know, I know you've been to Black Thunder and some of the other operations. The difference, and Mr. Winland's exactly right, as we progressed and gotten deeper in the Powder River Basin, there's going to be a large hole. And so you're going to have to haul from either stockpiles or other areas of the mine to backfill the final hole. So there's an absolute need for a shovel in our operations. I can't speak for the others, but there would be in ours, yes.
For what kind of timeline would you need a shovel for that backfill? You're just backfilling right against the coal face, so it isn't that big a
It's
job, is it?
hundreds of millions of yards, so it's, I think, what do we show, 8 to 10 years, I think what our current bonding plan shows that we turn in, so. But that also, and it continues to shrink, and probably one of the big things you'll see when you look at a balance sheet, if you looked at our balance sheet, you'd see an ARO of about $150 million at Thunder, where our bond's closer to $375 million. Again, we think it's overstated, but not by any stretch of the imagination that entire amount. As the mines get smaller, you kind of tighten everything up and close up, and so you've got a smaller hole in the end. When you're actually doing the bond, and the DEQ's right on this, if something happened to us tomorrow, you'd have to go from where you're at today, right? And so the hole would be bigger. And so, you know, in that part, that's accurate. But
Okay. Other questions? Other questions for the presenters? No? All right.
Can I say one more thing?
You bet.
Thank you so much for the severance tax reduction. That was much appreciated. Thank you again for the assigned trust. That was appreciated too. We appreciate that you're doing work for us. Arch Resources is 100% committed to being in business and closing out these mines in a responsible manner. We've got $100 million right now on our balance sheet in a sinking fund for our Wyoming operations. That should be to $130 to $140 million by the end of the second quarter. Since our ARO is 150, we'll probably hold there. We've met with our surety companies and they're good with that. But we're committed to operating here and doing things in an environmentally responsible manner. So thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for being a Wyoming coal miner.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Shannon Anderson on behalf of Powder River Basin Resource Council. I wasn't planning to say anything, but I figured I would just mention a few things. The first is this is just a guideline, of course. It's not in statute. It's not even in regulations. So there is a flexibility. As Mr. Wentland mentioned, it's revised annually and incorporates the best information available. And then the other thing I would mention is that the conversation you were just having, remember these bonds are set for the worst case. They're not set for the best case. And that's really important to protect the state of Wyoming. So we're not looking at, you know, how it progresses with a company doing it on the ground, getting all the way to the end. That's the best case because we want that to actually happen. The worst case is the company ups and leaves tomorrow, the state's left with a big hole in the ground, and we have to do that reclamation work with a third party. So again, we just want to make sure that you understand that these bonds are not set the best case for the company, they're set for the worst case for the state. And that's important to protect all of us as taxpayers in the state. So thank you.
Any questions for Ms. Anderson? Ms. Anderson, do you think we just heard that the company had an $8 million bond? and they cleaned up the work for $100,000. Do you think maybe we're kind of off on where our bond amounts are?
Mr. Chairman, I can only speak really for the Powder River Basin mines. I think that the Hannah Basin mine is a little bit of a different situation. I think actually the bond amounts, in my opinion, are almost too low in some cases. And I think, again, remember that on this scrap metal conversation you were just having, as Mr. Wentland mentioned, in some cases, in many cases, again, the company may own that, there may be a lien on it, there may be, Komatsu or Caterpillar owns it, Wyoming Machinery. And so the ability for the state, again, think of a third party coming in and doing the reclamation work on behalf of the state. The ability for the state to then, kind of factor in that scrap metal cost, I think is just unrealistic. And unless there was a really good almost lien to the state on that equipment, or the state having some kind of guarantee that at the time of, again, worst case bankruptcy, you're leaving the state tomorrow, the state is able to then sort of scrap those resources. But I don't think that's the case in many of the mines.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Anyone else like to speak on bonding? Bonding. Hearing none, we'll move right on to the next subject, agreement state status on thorium, I think we're talking about.
Mr.
And
Chairman?
we're back.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if there are follow-up questions on this first segment for me, I'd be happy to answer those. And then I think the next one was on land use changes. I'm sorry, I think the potential amendment to the agreement state was last. I can certainly change the order to accommodate your wishes.
What happened? I don't even have that on the list.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, you can proceed however you wish. It is that second bullet point on the agenda under DEQ issues.
I am the chairman, aren't I? Yeah. So
I'm here to accommodate your desires, Mr. Chairman.
why don't you go ahead with land use changes, please?
Okay. And like I said, Mr. Chairman, if there were follow-ups to the other discussion before we go there, I'm happy to address those. So when we go to the land use changes, this is again a outline for the committee. There's been a lot of discussions, and you just heard from your prior presenters from Arch Coal, that there may be some interest in these facilities over time, and rather than scrapping them out or going to demolition, there may be a desire to retain some of that infrastructure. So in that vein, there is a process for that. Aaron, the state has a process in our Coal Chapter 2, Section 6, and those rules and regs actually mirror the federal requirements in 30 CFR 715.13D. And I will tell you that the state's requirements here are the bare minimum. We have looked at that. They are the minimum requirement to do a land use change, and that's basically taking, let's just say for an example here, you take the facilities of a mine, which would encompass the rail, the conveyors, the silos, the loadouts, office complex, and shop. You could take that and repurpose that or recategorize that to an industrial facility. And then that could subsequently be removed out of the bond, and you would have the company come in and modify their permit boundary, and we would go to termination of jurisdiction. When that occurs, and this is the key thing to remember with that, with the rest of this discussion is once that occurs, there is no longer any bond to reclaim that site from the coal property side of it. So with that in mind, the permittee can come in and apply for a land use change to industrial or commercial from the approved post-mine land use, which in Wyoming, that approved use is generally domestic livestock and wildlife joint use is your approved post-mining land use. So the application that comes in, it needs to demonstrate that the proposed alternative land use is equal or higher than the previous use. Retaining that infrastructure is probably a higher use in some cases. That there is a reasonable likelihood of achieving this use. This is a demonstrated prove-up. Do you have a viable project here? And the best example I can give you is the Dave Johnston mine out here. We repurposed the shop facilities and office complex because when they did the wind farm, they needed the offices and they wanted the shop facilities to be able to do the assembly and repair on their nacelles. So we repurposed those and it basically terminated jurisdiction on that and it moved to the wind farm. Another example in Campbell County is the synthetic fuels operation where it was moved to the Atlas Carbon facility, was able to be done there. So we've done this multiple times in the state. Each one of these is a little unique. They generally have their own little intricacies to them, but we've done this process multiple times. But that's what the prove-up means, is it a viable option moving forward? Because you are releasing liability on those sites.
Mr. Chairman.
Yep, question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wetland, so Dave Johnson, if I'm not mistaken, that mine was completely reclaimed, correct?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. The mine was reclaimed and then they chose to repurpose those facilities.
Thank you.
Yep, and retain that infrastructure.
Yeah, question here.
Okay, so Mr. Wetland, I mean, you and I and Director Parfit and Campbell County Commissioners have been on calls and discussed this issue for a while, and so the issue, yeah, we released the bond, but what the division's looking for, the department's looking for, is really, you're looking at a viable transfer of liability.
Correct.
Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct, Mr. Chairman.
And so I know we've had successful situations and there isn't a tremendous amount of guidance here, but the avenue is forward. So, you know, the reason this is on the agenda is to find, you know, the solution or what the particular issue is, quite frankly, in Campbell County with facilities and rail spurs that make more sense to have them in the industrial inventory in the state of Wyoming rather than to see them tore out and go to scrap. And so I'm hoping that we can have a discussion to find what is the issue that prevents us from doing that.
Mr. Chairman, we are in agreement, and this process that we've outlined here in the presentation today, like I say, that mirrors the SMACR requirements, so we're bound by that in order to be in compliance with the primacy agreement. So to move away from that, it would require a change in SMACRA. I'm not sure that we're the bottleneck here. I think it would be good to hear from Campbell County maybe on this, because I think that transfer of liability is the big question.
Yeah.
I think you've hit on the principal item there.
So Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
One, I'm not blaming anybody being
No.
bottleneck, right? I want us being the state of Wyoming to find a solution for this. I assume the restrictions of SMACRA really are is to make sure that a bond is not released and then an asset sits and then falls into decay and becomes a stranded asset. That's the only thing you're looking at, or the primary thing you're looking at. Is that
Mr.
right?
Chairman, that is correct, because it's right here in my notes. It's development versus stranded asset. That's the key question. Yep.
Mr. Winland, one of the things that you have here is that it's equal or higher than the previous use. How do you measure that higher use, and what is that?
Mr. Chairman, that higher use in this case, I think the infrastructure is a higher use than livestock grazing on that site. That's usually, in the Glen Rock case, that's a good example, you know, where we had that shop and facilities was able to be repurposed to a new use that was commercial industrial to facilitate that wind farm growth. So sorry, Mr. Chairman, I was looking at the definition just to make sure we weren't in something different there.
Okay,
But yeah,
all right.
you're spot on. I mean, we've repurposed and, like say, the wind farm, we did the synthetic fuels to Atlas Carbon. We also did recently the rail siting over at the Bighorn Mine just last fall, where they had car storage and rail storage. They wanted to retain that as a siting. We did that one. We've had a loadout over at Kirby. We've done this multiple times across the state. The biggest part of this too, with being in compliance with SMACRA, is there is a public notification part of that process. It's in my second slide on this. You have 30 days notice, 30 days public comment, because you are formally changing the land use. And that's a requirement with SMACRA. And I think, yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think you hit on the key one. It's the transfer of the liability, and you don't want a stranded asset here where you have no way to go forward. I think the example would be a 2 Elk in that scenario.
You mentioned the Bighorn operation. Did we keep those loadout facilities there that are pretty historic? I think they're built in the turn of the century.
I would have to look back on that. I know what the focus was on the rail siting. I actually was recused from that process on that one, so I'm not as familiar with that particular site. Mr. Chairman, that's correct. We take that very seriously, and we do take that very seriously.
Yes, question. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm curious if any other states have models for how this land use change can be implemented in an effective and streamlined fashion. Is this something where we're looking to be a pioneer with regard to the SMACRA implementation, or have other states kind of mastered and chartered a path, and we just need to be looking to them to figure out what the best practices are?
Mr. Chairman, the other states that have primacy, like Wyoming, follow this exact same process because it's exactly right out of the SMACRA provisions. So it's not new ground. It's been done in a lot of different states on a lot of different properties and following that requirement. And again, I would just go back, Mr. Chairman, and say we have the very bare minimum of those requirements for that change.
Yeah.
And I realize we need to hear from others, but so would a transfer to an economic development organization or to a county to be held in inventory be acceptable, or what would be the factors that the department would look at in that situation?
Mr. Chairman, we had that discussion with one of the counties recently that, you know, do you make that transfer and then maybe lease the site back to, let's say, the company while they're in closure or final reclamation? We've never pursued that particular path, but I don't see an obstruction to that path. I think the thing there is if you're going to make that transfer, is that you have somebody that can pay the power bill, keep the power on, the heat on, the water, so you don't wind up freezing pipes and winding up with an asset that is somehow diminished or damaged and then try and transfer it. I think it becomes, who is that viable entity? And to your question earlier, who's taking that liability? And is that a viable entity taking that liability?
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. And I do believe this is an important issue to to deal with. You know, so if you know, a loadout facility was left partially intact with all of the rail infrastructure and buildings and shops, just for example, and a county assumed that property and maybe they worked to the arrangement to lease it back, then it would be found that the bond would be released. No other bond would be required on it, okay?
That's correct.
And then we get to the issue of then if it was later abandoned 15, 20 years from there. Is that a factor that you look at, or would you look at if a county were to take that liability or take over that asset, then you've met the requirements of SMACRA and it would be acceptable? Yeah, I'm pushing a little here, but just.
Yeah,
trying to sort-
Mr. Chairman, we've not processed one of those in that fashion, but as long as there's a viable, and it says, if you go back in the, let me just make sure I get to the right one here. If you go back to my sub-bullet points there under the application needs to demonstrate, go down to the bottom fourth bullet. I think here's the catch line out of SMACRA that applies. The use will not be impractical, unreasonable, inconsistent with the applicable land use policies or plans, involve an unreasonable delay in implementation, or cause or contribute to violation of federal or state or local law. So I think the two key things there are, is it consistent, is it applicable, and is there going to be an unreasonable delay in implementation?
So
Go
then,
ahead.
Mr. Chairman, okay, we got to the point.
Yeah.
Which is, if you hold it for future economic development, it's speculative, no matter how you define it. Okay, so, it is, just because something's speculative and it takes 5 years, is that an unreasonable delay? How is that going to be
That's-
received and interpreted, I think, is where we're at.
I think the state would interpret that as, as if the asset were in good condition and it weren't stranded, I think you would see the state take a position that that's probably reasonable. I can't speak to what OSM, because they do have to sign off on this.
Go ahead with your
I'm
question,
sorry,
yeah.
Mr. Chairman. I stayed quiet on the first one, because then, much with anything with economic development, right, is chicken or the egg component of it is, yeah, well, this would work wonderfully if you had that prospective business all ready to come in. But the real question is, okay, do you have the asset available? Then that attracts that component in. So those are the issues we're dealing with.
Mr. Chairman, maybe to address that, that's one of the things that we talked about, and it sounds like the Business Council has a handle on this, and I wasn't as familiar with it. It was follow-up in our several discussions with Campbell County. But having a site index out there that says, if I'm a company and I want fiber network, I need a change room that'll do 100 people, I need a rail spur, I need an office complex. Do you have a database out there statewide that can search those sites and pair and match those sites with those potential or prospective interests that you're implying here maybe? And, that to me is some of bridging that gap that you're talking about.
You done?
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the discussion.
That's nice of you, Kyle. Is that it on land use changes?
For our presentation, Mr. Chairman, that's correct. I do believe you probably have public.
This would apply to anything and everything, not specifically coal mines. It would
Miss-
apply to wind farms and solar sites and those kind of things. You would release the bonds on those too, wouldn't you?
Mr. Chairman, I can't speak to that. The only parts of this that I can speak to are the mining facilities, be it coal or non-coal. Those other facilities, I can't speak to how that would be viewed.
Would that
That's
be
outs-
because there are no bonds on them?
Mr. Chairman, again, that's not my area of expertise.
Oh, okay. Is it yours?
No, it's not.
Oh. Okay.
Good answer.
All right.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
It
yes.
is not mine either.
And you stayed to Holiday Inn last night. Yeah. All right, we're going to have a public comment on land use then. I think we got some people interested in commenting on land use. We got them coming from all over. Whoever gets there first gets the, going to be together, huh, Jeremiah? All right. If we can't fix it, it ain't broke.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members
Good
of the
morning.
committee. I'm Jeremiah Riemann here on behalf of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. This is a topic that we're very interested in statewide. We believe that there are a number of industrial assets that could be reutilized for economic purposes for counties, for the state. I'm going to be the arm candy today for this presentation, and I'm actually going to turn it over to the gentleman to my left. I'll introduce them quickly. We have Commissioner Rusty Bell from Campbell County, and then Jim Ford, who consults with Campbell County as well.
Great, thank you, Mr.
Presentation there.
Probably the shortest one you're going to get from him.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, Rusty Bell, Campbell County Commissioner. Appreciate the conversation on this, and Chairman Greer really touched on a lot of the issues I think that we've been discussing with DEQ and with the governor's office and with some of the legislative folks for the last year or so. Really trying to find a path forward, a playbook per se to work with the companies that are there with the what we call liabilities, what we've heard through bonding and all of that, that what we actually call liabilities right now throughout the state with a lot of those sites in Campbell County, that really you can turn that into, are we going to reclassify that, and how do we reclassify those as assets for Wyoming, and how do we use those? And so that really is the gist of that, working with you, working with the companies, because they're the ones that have these assets to them now, which are liabilities, but we want to turn those into an asset for Wyoming so that we can market those through local economic development, through Wyoming Business Council, whatever means we can to use those. And I think we get into a couple points of emphasis, and Mr. Wetland talked a little bit about it, but really how that timing works is important. And when I say that, the timing on how a reclamation process moves forward. One of the first things that they do when they enter a reclamation phase is they're going to take the conveyors out, things that are worth money to sell right away. Those are going to go. Then the rail spurs are going to come out. They're going to salvage that scrap however they can. And the last things that are going to stay are the change out rooms and things that they're going to need for employees to continue doing that pit reclamation and that other reclamation. So what we want to do is have a playbook that is proactive, that is, and that can take years, right? So we want to be able to find a way to, whether it's through zoning, whether it's through whatever kind of means that we can, to save those assets statewide, countywide, and use those in the future for economic development. I mean, that's really where we're at, and finding the means to do that. And how that works, I'm not 100% sure, but I think that the counties can be involved with that. I think the state can be involved with that. I think the marketing and those kind of things can the Wyoming Business Council can be involved with that. We have some sites that were successes, one in Campbell County, one in Converse County. And I think that we can build off those. There is a process forward. I don't think that process going to the federal bureaucracy and trying to change those SMACRA rules probably is going to be easy to do. We're not going to even probably talk about that. But finding a way that if it's successful or if it's allowed through those rules to have an overarching development park, industrial park, is that specific enough? I'm not sure, but that's how the Fort Union Industrial Park has developed. Do each one of those specific entities coming into those industrial parks, does each one of those have to be approved? Can we overall county zone the whole thing? Can we zone all the rail? Can we is there some parameters that we can use in helping set that playbook? I'm not sure. And when it comes down to what Chairman Greer asked about the overall liability of what happens with those sites at the end, if what time is considered too long, I don't know. And if there's a stranded asset and we ultimately have that, asset that's in our county and it hasn't been used for a certain amount of time, and there's no liability, there's no bonding requirement because we were able to pull that out, is that a big deal? I think that's a question for all of us. I don't know that. I mean, if we had an industrial site that was in the city of Gillette and it was vacant for a while, we would continue to try to market that. I think that's the same kind of thing. We would do that even if it's more rural. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure I have all the answers, but I think that maybe between your committee and us and the gentleman, the folks sitting behind us, we can come up with a playbook to move this forward. And I'll leave it to Jim. Jim was the project manager for the Fort Union Industrial Park and getting that thing rolling out. So he has a lot of insight on how this works.
Well, before we move to Mr. Ford, Commissioner Bell, I guess the industrial sites I was thinking wouldn't necessarily need rail, but you're thinking it would be good to include that, the rail spur in your area?
So, Mr. Chairman, there's hundreds of millions of dollars worth of rail in Campbell County alone. And without knowing who's going to need what, I think I would hate to say you'd want to tear out a rail spur in, say, 12 different sites, although they might all not need a rail spur with whoever comes in, whatever happens. Without knowing that, I don't know how you would justify tearing one out, because I know what the cost is to put them back in.
So we wouldn't even want to start the reclamation with starting with the rail spurs. Then we would want to keep all that whole.
I think
Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, I agree. I think that whole that infrastructure is rail included, and these sites have very good power, water, buildings, silos, a lot of different things, not all the same, but all similar. And I think that not knowing what that knew, whether it's rare earth processing or, rare earth mining, whether it's who knows what, there's so much speculation on what and if a company X from a different state wanted to move here and we had 4 sites to look at, they're going to pick the one that's best for them. The other thing I think that we have to really keep in mind is, in order to be proactive with the companies that are using these sites right now, and who hopefully are going to be using these sites for the next couple decades, we have to make it, we have to work with them. I mean, they have to, in order, we're talking about having these sites. Well, these sites are owned by somebody else right now. Although they are bonded, and you heard that they're bonded quite a bit of dollars out there to reclaim that, do that demolition and that kind of stuff. I would imagine those sites, if they could walk away from those sites with no liability, no future liability, I would imagine you could have those sites for a fairly, I can't speak for them, fairly inexpensive.
Okay. Any questions? Any questions? Oh, yes. Representative Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Bell, we heard Mr. Wentland speak of upkeep. Have you looked at that as far as what it would take? I can see the issue now is the timing, as you mentioned, not necessarily after complete reclamation, but during the mines moving out of the use of those facilities and on to some other stage of their operation, and you want to keep those assets going. If that were to turn over to some government entity like a county, they would necessarily have to keep those facilities up. Have you looked at the cost of that and thought about what that would be for the taxpayers of the community?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bear, so I don't know that. I know it's probably significant. I know that certain sites, just to have the power, there is going to be $25,000 a year or something like that. It might be more at a site that's larger. Having that being said, looking at being proactive, are we willing to tear those sites out and turn them into sagebrush instead of actually taking the I guess you could say risk to being able to move something else in there in the future. You know, I think that also goes to having a conversation with the power companies, with the rail folks, because ultimately they want to have that. They want to have a new service there. They want somebody to be able to sell power to. They want somebody to be able to sell rail to, those kind of things. You know, having that conversation with them, which we haven't. I mean, we're at a very early stage, that we want to have that relationship with them to say, you know, we're really trying. We're going to work hard to get somebody into that site. Are you willing to work with us on that? So I don't have those costs. I think they are probably, depending on the size of the site and those kind of things, it probably varies, but it is significant. There's no doubt about that.
Chairman Greer, did you have a question, or were you just?
Mr. Chairman, more of a comment, Commissioner Bell, is, so we need a playbook, but I think in the situation we're talking about is the county needs to have a playbook or their CDL. And then look at what obstacles are in the way that maybe the legislature can solve. I mean, I just sit here and rattle things around just a little bit, but issues of working with the business council, looking at certain financial assurances to a certain degree. But one is just as a simple statutory statement that an asset being placed into economic development inventory is actually a use, even though it may not be having rail cars run through it right at a specific point in time. There are, just little nuances there that give us the ability to operate within our primacy under SMACRA but we need to have, what is it you want? You want to try to hold 12 sites in Campbell County? I don't think that's realistic. What is the best site? What is the most logical? And I think those are how we've got to push the discussion forward. Just me thinking about it here for actually well over a year, but anyway.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I agree. There's probably something to be said for a feasibility study of these sites, what the timing is on those sites being, end of life on the mining permits and that kind of thing. If those companies are going to continue to seek new permit more coal, some of those things, I think you're right. There are some sites right now that are available, but they're inside of that. They're inside of that mine reclamation boundary, and maybe we just have to do some pilot projects and see how it works. And as a coal mine or as an entity are working and they're continuing to work actively mining thermal coal, they have parts of their site that are not being used. Those already could be marketed, and I think that's probably the first step. But looking further out, having a playbook that says if we're going to continue to mine for another 10 years or 12 years or 15 years, at what year do we start this process to go to the county? And I think that's what we're probably talking about the same thing, but you're right. Figuring out that timeline is important.
Now we can go to Mr. Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Jim Ford. I'm a partner in and general manager of Fort Union Industrial Park, as well as an appointed board member from Campbell County's perspective with our local community development organization, Energy Capital EDC, there in Gillette. I'd like to speak to you today from the perspective of a private developer that has been through the process that Mr. Wentland described in seeing a mine property converted from a defunct and bankrupt mine property into a successful industrial park. I think there's opportunity here in this topic to tie together the future of these assets that the coal industry has developed here, particularly in the Powder River Basin. Other mining sectors in other parts of the states have brought tremendous infrastructure and capabilities for industries other than their original or primary use, if we're able to apply a little bit of imagination and flexibility. From a private developer's perspective, I can easily come at all of these questions about the mine bonding questions, industrial reuse, and start to think about what I see as assets rather than liabilities. Other industrial users and customers that have shown that these mine properties can in fact be assets and don't need to be understood as liabilities as a default. 35, 40, 45 years ago, when mine plans were written that envisioned reclamation at end of mine use and return to the previous use, made a lot of sense then. When Campbell County may have been 6,000 or 8,000 people instead of almost 50,000 people. That may have been the right decision. Maybe not so much now. So I'd just like to speak to you from the perspective of someone who's been through that process of taking a mine property, reimagining that at some risk and at some significant expense in time, and coming out the other side of that, having industrial property that is in fact an asset today. So happy to stand for any of your questions.
Mr. Ford, did you use the rail spur? Did you use any of the rail?
Absolutely.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, we have industrial transload facilities there at that site now. Today, it is frac sand. It could easily be anything else.
Other questions? Representative Sherwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Block. If you could walk us through your timeline, like from concept of business proposal all the way to, say, switching over and move-in date, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative Sherwood, I can explain that. I think it is probably a worst-case scenario, which is okay, because I would like to see that be better for the next perspective. So we are owners and developers of an industrial park. I'd like to see competition from a community perspective, from someone who wants to see Gillette and Campbell County and the entire Powder River Basin prosper. I want to see this happen again. So our timeline started out in the worst possible scenario because that facility had fallen into bankruptcy from a previous operator. There was 3.5 years that the property was locked up in immense bankruptcy. My partner and I were able to acquire that, and it was a stepwise process. And I think it's important to separate discussions about the bonding and reclamation on this issue to, this may not be the right terminology, but the area bond, or saying the pit versus the incremental bond areas, which would be things like the rail, the shops, the offices, the water wells, the natural gas pipelines, the power infrastructure, all those things that developers can easily imagine as assets and not liabilities. I do think it's important to say the mine, but in two big baskets, I believe, of types of property. So over about 6.5 years, we were able to take a roughly 2,700 acre mine permit boundary, change through the standing process that did work, and with guidance and participation through Land Quality Division. They helped us along every step of the way. And we were able to take that large mine site and shrink that down to what is approximately 900 acres of reclaimed land that was the pit area, and 460 acres of land around those facilities that is zoned and subdivided. So a 460 acre industrial park resulted 900 acre reclamation area. The rest of the lands that were undisturbed were returned to, they were still owned by third parties, but they're not in the mine permit boundary anymore.
Does that do it? All right. Senator Rothfuss, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm curious how far along things have gone in terms of really creating a full inventory of everything that's available. Clearly, you've done it on your project, but getting to the broader look at the future and understanding of that, kind of the assets, the liabilities, and the prospectus of what's there is, I assume that's underway, but I'm curious how far down that path the team is.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I can take that. Senator Rothfuss, it's sort of on the way. You know, I mean, I know that's not a great answer, but until we find out if there's, if a generic or overall zoning plan can actually work and be specific enough, I think that's something that we have to find out. And then honestly, if there's the stomach to have either the state or the county or whoever have these up to 12 maybe sites that we're trying to move over the next couple decades into a different use, is there an appetite to be able to have a liability out there, if we're going to call it that? And I think that's kind of where we're struggling a little bit, and having the partnership with the state level and with everybody to say, let's work through this. It makes sense to use these sites instead of tearing up new green fields. It really does. I just, and I think that, and maybe I don't want to put the Wyoming Business Council on the hot seat, but I think they'll be up here to talk that maybe there's a way to partnership on an inventory, a feasibility study / an inventory, a study that works with the companies to say, you know what, we maybe have this site that's available now, we maybe have this site that's available in 5 years. There's some companies that maybe don't have any sites, which is great, right? They're going to continue to mine thermal coal for 20 years out, and that's what we want them to do. So maybe they don't have anything right now but in the future, if they're going to have that incentive to say, we can get this bond back on this industrial site, we can transfer that over to an entity, and that's an incentive for us. We still at least want to be in the queue, even if it's 20 years from now. So there is a playbook to do that. So I think that process, needs to start today. I hope there's some action items that we can come out of this meeting with, instead of just kind of going on our own to do this. I would like to see something like that, but that's a great question. And then does it need to be backfilled with any kind of dollars? That's another question.
Well, that was the next question, Mr. Chairman, is getting to the backfill with dollars. I think the answer is unequivocally yes. We would like that not to be true, but there's going to be a transition cost. It's sort of like the valley of death for a business model. I look at that as one significant valley of death for that transition. What is a realistic approach to funding that? I mean, you look at other places that are going through coal transition or transitions in their economy, they typically generate a revenue stream early on, trickle in that revenue stream, end up with a transition fund, and then use those funds to back invest in the transition. So you've fully committed funds, but you're generating the funds as part of the timeline for the transition. We've done no such thing, right? We have no foresight on the this is going to happen side to develop funds. Might even be going the other direction a lot of the time. So how can we get to the point where we generate some type of an ongoing revenue stream that provides availability of resources? Because I think this is an essential idea. The idea that we would tear up $100 million worth of assets because we're not using them tomorrow, and at the same time later we'll re-damage the same location for environmental purposes, we'll pay for it a second time. None of that makes any sense. So this is an important investment for us, but where are the funds going to come from? Who should pay for those funds? Is it just the state going to its general funds and writing a check? Is it the county? I mean, these are the hard questions we have to answer. everyone here is gonna get behind the, let's do this. But the serious conversation is, where's the money come from? So that's my question.
So
Mr.
did you
Chairman.
get his question?
Got it. I was somewhat expecting it. So, Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, so, North Dakota had set this up 40 years ago where they have a lignite council where they put 10 cents a ton into this fund and they had it. You're right, Wyoming hasn't done anything like that. Looking at this interagency working group for repurposing coal assets that I've been involved with over the last few months, most of these things are happening with somebody that's gone bankrupt. These things are brownfields. They're not being proactive like we're trying to do. And actually, it's a harder process to be proactive than it is, it seems like, to just beg for money after there's already this, this worst case scenario. So to answer your question, I'm just going to throw it out there. We just had this conversation about severance tax and lowering it from 7 to 6.5, and at least there's a mechanism there that if you took a 1/4 cent or 1/4 cent or another 1/2 cent and you put that in there into an account for a certain amount of years, there would be some dollars in there to offset that liability. And as those sites come out of that liability, they have a specific use, they're brought out of that bond, then you have less liability. And I think that there's something to be said for that. I don't know whether it would take 5 years, which would be around $50 million, or whether it would take 10 years, around 100. I don't know. But I think that brings a dollar amount to the table. It's the only thing I can think of. I realize that's probably general funds, but that's just a different way to look at it.
Yes.
Well, and this would be wildly popular, but we did just cut severance taxes. A 10 cents per ton model, which is what was done for the lignite, makes sense. This is something that has been talked about for a number of years, creating a transition fund by having a fee, not a tax, a fee of 10 cents for transition per ton. How's that for an idea?
Mr. Chairman, I would have to ask the companies on that, because I know that they're, a lot of times with their contracted coal out, for their margins are pretty low, and their overburden a lot of times is getting bigger, and so the costs are higher. Fuel costs they would tell you that are off the charts right now. So their margins are fairly low. If you add 10 cents to that, I think that would not be, they would not like that.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I agree. They would object, but this gets back to the challenge of it being a hard question. I don't think the legislature really wants to give up millions of dollars from the general fund either, because that's other taxpayers paying those funds. It turns out we don't have any money that comes from nowhere. And so we're always going to be spending someone's tax revenue. And the question is, where does that revenue come from if we want to do this? You're absolutely right. This is essential. I'm on board. But we can't keep having the conversation that the general fund is an infinite fund. We can just keep cutting. We can lower taxes. We can let that go aside and spend from it. And then at the same time, start new programs. So this is not the end of the conversation, obviously, but this is a conversation I would ask you to go back and have with your producers, the folks in your community. This will be easy if we get to the point where we have a revenue source. This will not be easy without the revenue source. That's the only challenge that I think we have before us, is a revenue source.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, I agree. Just like everything, if we had the dollars, it would be easy. And but I think, being the eternal optimist that I try to be, really what we're trying to do is have a dollar amount that's going to backfill our 100% success rate on putting somebody into each one of these sites. And I'll put that on the Wyoming Business Council and Economic Development, and then they can yell at me about that. But I think that's the concept that I'm trying to think, is what is that dollar amount to say that we would, if we were going to bond those sites, all of them, and then as those come out, that it gets taken off the dole, and ultimately it's at zero. I don't know if that's possible, but anyway.
One other thing that is plausible, but it is a challenge, and it gets back to the previous presentation we had, is it's not as if there aren't bonded funds available that realistically are attributed to those areas and would be expended were it not for moving this forward. The challenge is we can't know with certainty what the actual expenditure would be, so it's hard to true up that deal if we wanted to delay the utility of it. So that's another thing that certainly should be looked at as a revenue source if there were a way to do that. But at that point, you are getting into SMACRA, you're getting into federal challenges for the utilization of those funds. So I don't know how you get to that point, but I do know that the trust we just put in place is going to probably be a more flexible solution because it's real dollars as opposed to bonded dollars. So as that becomes more and more utilized, I would suspect we have more utility for using those funds and bringing them to this type of project. Because from the vantage point of a company that either has to use their bond to tear everything up, reclaim, and leave, versus use exactly the same amount of dollars, or even better, $1 less, to facilitate a transition, hand the money over, and not have liability, it means nothing for that company, right? Same at the bottom line on the balance sheet. So I think that's available, but the complexity of accessing those funds, I think, is incredibly challenging. So I don't know.
So just to wrap up Senator Roth's discussion and questions, I think he's volunteering some University of Wyoming money to do this with, I think is what he really wanted to say. Mr. Ford, you have some tenants at your location at Fort Union there. Did they come to you, or did you have to go search nationwide for tenants? And I'm thinking, how easy would it be to find tenants for other locations?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So relative to Fort Union Industrial Park, we have 5 tenants on site currently, 3 owners, 2 that are under long-term leases. We're about, say, 20% occupied as far as our acreage goes, where that's concerned. So some large undeveloped tracts that are still available there. It was 100% walk-up business. We did not have to solicit customers. We did not recruit. They came and knocked on our doors.
So were there some that you turned away that could be potential in the future for other sites?
Yeah, for sure. These types of facilities that, were originally built for single purpose, coal export only, there's certain character there that not a lot of businesses can fit. It does take a special type of customer. Certain industry sectors are definitely better suited than others. So we've probably engaged with and turned away 5 times that many.
Wow.
And some of those were a phone call that didn't even justify a second conversation. But I've been pleased with the potential deal flow there.
Yeah, for sure. Any other questions besides Senator Rothfuss for? Yes, Representative Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. More of a statement than a question. I think out of the good senator's comments, I gathered that a suggestion that we should look at the actual mining operation, possibly funding this in exchange for some of their bonding requirements. And that is an idea I think we really should look at. Thank you.
Yes,
Mr. Chairman, if I could, to the question of funding, purely my personal opinion on this, we hear about the mining companies and where money could come from. There's other parties that I think could stand to benefit from keeping these sites alive. And I do think that the timing in, this interim period between as the mining use declines and comes to an end and who comes next, it's probably not a one-day turnaround from one to the next. So I think that a look at that interim period to just hold serve for a while should really be in the discussion. But the railroads the utilities, the G&Ts, as well as the local distribution companies, they all stand to benefit from keeping these sites alive. And I think that at least bringing those entities into the conversation is appropriate.
Good, good. Any other questions over here? All right, hearing none. Thank you for your presentation. Oh, we have one over here.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sherwood.
Thank you so much. This is just more of as we think about this pathway, understanding that there is a need to go to industry and to see where they're at in this process of transitioning, right? And maybe creating a database of that, and we'll just say at the county level, and then overlaying that information with the applicable land use policies and plans that the county has, and working with local planners, understanding the potential new uses of those sites. And then when we think about the state's role in this and incentivizing and working with the business council, know that there's a great difference between a committed business who is ready to move into that site. That timeline is going to be a lot quicker than a speculative use that maybe the county holds and is marketing. And so as we develop that pathway, know that those are two parts where the strategy might differ between committed business and then speculation. So thank you.
Thank you for your observation. All right, thank you, Min. Thank you for your presentation. Is there anyone else who wants to talk on repurposing? I would think there would be somebody over there that might want to talk about that. You've been kind of prompted to speak here.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Josh Durrell. I'm the CEO of the Business Council, essentially the director of the state's Economic Development Agency. I have been prompted, thank you for calling me up, and I do want to talk to Commissioner Bell's statement about, well, let's be honest, it was passing the buck to the Business Council on funding some of these things. And I just want to say that I'll likely just pass the buck to JAC because that's how it works, right? That's where I get my funding. And I'll be a little bit more eloquent about that in a moment, because I do think that there are some really important things to think about when it comes to what he was speaking about on feasibility. I guess just from my agency's perspective, and what we say is what's in our boat. And what I mean by that is what can we control and what can we affect with our charge as an executive branch agency for economic development from the funding that we get from the legislature and the programs that we have. So I'm going to keep it kind of simple here. We do believe that keeping these economic development assets in place makes a lot of sense. That's I think everyone agrees with that. There's also been a lot of discussion about all of the factors, and I think the chairman mentioned a number of those factors that are really the crux of the issue. And so, but those are outside our boat. What's inside our boat right now is that we do have funding mechanisms that can be utilized for these sites. We do have ways that we can help with the planning of these. So we have loan programs, we have the BRC grant program that includes planning grants that can be utilized for the purposes of feasibility, the purposes of planning, and even the purposes of community or economic development owned assets and infrastructure. So we have those today, and I think that those could be utilized in these situations. I'll talk a little bit more about feasibility in a moment, but I also want to, there was another point about recruiting, and we do have a way and a clearinghouse of all of the economic development or industrial sites or sites throughout the state that is called WyomingSites.com. And that is an inventory of all of the assets that we know about today that can be marketed in a community. Now, that's essentially the responsibility of that community to put up their sites onto that site so that those can be marketed or that we can know about them as we're approached by folks who do economic development or site selection throughout the country. One of the challenges here that we need to think about was brought up earlier. Who owns those assets today, and are they willing to market them to another company in the future or today so that we can begin that chicken and egg process? Because it is a bit of a chicken and egg process. It's hard to say that we've had, hundreds of heavy industrial, opportunities when we don't have any heavy industrial sites to offer. But at the same time, we want to be able to say these are potentially sites that could be used for heavy industry. And of course, the challenge there is that those site selectors and those companies will say, yeah, but are they really feasible? Are they really available? What are they really versus other places that might have those? So I bring all of this up to you to just think about the issues and think about the idea of doing feasibility or doing planning around these sites, getting those sites into like WyomingSites.com, where they can be viewed and marketed by us as well as the site selectors around the country. If we can do that, we absolutely will. But again, we can't go and force someone to put their site on there. Now, we have had some initial discussions with folks who are thinking, hey, that sounds like a good idea, even though this is something that we hold today as a private company. This may be something we would want to offer up. So there is interest in doing that, and we want to make ourselves available. Those things are already in place. Funding mechanisms through BRC and our loan programs already in place. Planning through those programs already in place. Now, Commissioner Bell mentioned a really interesting concept of partnering perhaps with the Business Council to do feasibility with these. Again, we have that mechanism through BRC planning. Right now, our max amount for planning is $50,000. These particular studies will probably be in the range between $80,000 and $150,000, depending on exactly the scope of that and the breadth of it. So it's important to understand that for 12 sites, that could be a substantial amount of money. For maybe the best 4 or 5, obviously you can scale that. So I think it's important for us to understand that we do have buckets of money for things like this. However, we need to take a look at perhaps maybe there's something else where we could administer a program that only looks at feasibility of industrial sites. It could be outside of BRC. This is not something that we've budgeted for. It's not something that's in our budget today. But that is something that we could look at to do. Now, where those funds come from, that's going to be up to the pleasure of the Joint Appropriations Committee and the rest of the body to decide that. Today, we have some money in BRC that can be used for some of those things. And I guess the way I kind of look at it is, if we can do some of these simple things, it will push things forward so that we'll know more of the questions. Right now, there are a whole lot of questions out there and not a lot of answers. I think some of these feasibility information could get us a little bit closer to understanding whether it's really worthwhile or not. So I guess what I'm saying is that the Business Council does have tools available. The Business Council is willing and able to do these things. And with that, I'll stand for questions.
Any questions for Josh? Yes. Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess, these feasibility studies, I have a lot of questions on what exactly they do. I mean, distance from town, Google Maps, inventory of the buildings, that's a site visit. Back when I was in college, we used to joke that going into these sorts of consulting reports for governments was absolutely the best thing to, from a financial perspective, because I just don't see, $100,000 for a report. What are we going to bring about, effectuate from more feasibility studies? The question is there capital, identifying, cold calling, or whatever it's going to take to identify that capital, okay? And I don't know how a feasibility study is going to do that. So I guess I asked, would you agree or probably going to counter that. So thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, I would agree that we should ask a hard question about feasibility studies, but I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a company that wants to outlay millions of dollars to take over a site like that and utilize it for heavy industry. And I want you to think about, would you do that on a cold call, or would you do that on no information? These are ways for us to market that particular property so that people know going in, what are the issues? What are the problems? What are the opportunities there? So the way I look at it is, it's actually an investment in marketing it. It's also an investment for the state to know whether it's a worthwhile asset to put more money into. And so, yes, we should always ask that question. But yes, we realize that in the game of economic development, those studies are actually marketing documents. Hopefully that answers your question.
Representative Sherwood, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in the economic development world, we like to say that money comes to plans, right? So taking that time to invest in a feasibility study and answering all of those unknowns to the best of your ability, right, reassures industry that they can make an investment, and then they can move forward with a plan. So I personally would like us to have the conversation about either raising the max that's currently allowed in the feasibility grant, so from 50 to higher, or creating another pot of funds that are specific to repurposing these industrial sites. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your comment.
Oh, Mr.
Any
Chairman,
oth-
I would agree.
Any other questions for Josh? Yes. Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Durrell, you mentioned the WyomingSites.com. First question is it sounds like county could go to the individual mines, discuss with them who owns the assets, what are the assets, and get that put on the site today. They could do that. So that's the first question. And the second one, when you talk about the BRC loan and grant money that's available, a comment was made earlier about this being the Death Valley of business. Do we really want to tie up those funds in something where it's a buy it and hopefully they will come later situation? And in many of these cases, it's many years later. Thank you.
Go ahead, Josh.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, Representative Bear, two excellent questions. The answer to your first question is relatively simple. Yes, the answer is yes. That is the process for getting those sites onto WyomingSites.com. The answer to your second question is the process for utilizing the BRC funds still has a number of steps that have to happen before those funds can be allocated. So that application would have to be made. It would have to match our investment thesis and our evaluation of the project at a staff level. And that goes to our committee, which is made up of members of our board of directors, which is 13 business people throughout the state, co-chaired by the governor. And then it goes to our board for approval. If all of those steps are relatively positive, our board makes a recommendation to SLIB. So the 5 electeds then decide, is this a worthwhile investment of state funds? So it is not a guarantee of funds, but it is an avenue to funds, again, that match our strategy, our investment thesis, and is recommended by our board and then approved by SLIB. Hopefully that answers your question.
Question.
We just make this way too hard. This is a heavily regulated industry. We just spent the morning talking about all of the data and the volumes of work that go into what is on a site, what it costs to reclaim, what liabilities are there. Whether or not a location or a site's going to be used 5 years from now or 10 years from now is a long-term plan of each one of these companies. My suggestion would be, is just get an inventory of this, and then you can sit down and look at a site selection, and then maybe look forward and see what out of 1 or 2 or 3 sites, what opportunities are there, and within certain time windows, and forgo. And I agree 100% with Representative Gray. Is forego the glossy printouts with a copy of Google Maps. there's got to be a more reasonable way with this. And again, we're talking about a heavily regulated and very directed industry. The data's there already. Would you agree, Director?
Would you agree, Director?
And you don't have to.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Chairman, I would agree that the data is there. But I would also agree that when it comes to economic development and working with the larger companies than site selectors that are looking at sites, they're going to need that information. And we want to make it as easy as possible for them to choose these sites over the other sites that we are competing with. And so while I agree 100% with what you said, it may be more complex than that. That's all I'm saying. And there are many things about our lives that are a little more complicated than they should be. I totally agree with that as well.
All right, Josh, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Oh, another question.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, we just recently heard testimony, Mr. Ford talked about an industrial site that him and his partner were able to put into service. They identified it, got industry involved, and is very successful at this point. Was the Wyoming Business Council involved in this, and what role did you have in marketing that site and bringing that to fruition?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Heiner, good question. That was before my time, so I don't know the details of the marketing. However, I do know that we are involved in the funding of that with the large loan program of Atlas Carbon, not the site.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Before we go to the next public comment, we're going to take a break so the audience can ambush the committee. And I know you won't do that. 10-minute break. 10-minute break. In the break room, there is
banged a gavel and they left. Right? All right, I think this is probably my sense of importance. I'm gonna lead you, so total domination.
All right. I don't know. Well, safe travels. Have a good class.
All right. See you later.
See you.
Yeah, I'm out of here. A little bit early. I'm trying to speed up your meeting by leaving.
Well, you will.
Oh, you're gonna shave 2 hours
Thanks.
off the meeting. Exactly. I get you out in time. All right.
Okay, we're call the meeting back to order. Are we online? Are we online? Okay, we are. So the next order of business is public comment on the repurposing. That's you. That's you, yeah. Just push it till
Okay,
it gets
we're on.
green.
Good morning, Chairman Anderson and representatives and senators. Thank you for letting me appear today. This is a very important topic. First of all, my
Put
name
that
is
a little
Phil
closer to your
Christopherson.
mouth.
That better?
Yeah.
Okay, my name is Phil Christopherson. I'm the CEO of Energy Capital Economic Development in Campbell County. I'm also the current president of WEDA, the Wyoming Economic Development Association. I'm speaking kind of on both roles right now. This is a very important topic. The idea of identifying this industrial space that is currently mine and converting it into something that is usable. There is a process in place. Unfortunately, it moves very slow. When a business comes to the state, they want to move quickly. They want to find a spot and go. Business moves at the speed of business, government moves at the speed of government. And that's two different speeds. I'm going to give you an example of a current project that is looking at Campbell County and Texas and Alabama and Georgia. They came to us about 2.5 years ago from a Wyoming Business Council lead. I'm going to call it Project ABC, and that is not the real name of the project because a lot of it's confidential. But they came to Gillette and said, do you have any industrial properties of about 60 acres that we could set up a large industrial facility? And we had very few details on the facility, but they gave us an extensive list of what they were looking for. It took us about two weeks to gather all the information and put it together on the couple of sites that we had. 2 of the sites were still owned and operated as mine sites. One happened to be Fort Union Industrial Park, which 10 years ago, Mr. Ford started assembling and building into an industrial park. Because he had done that 10 years ago and got it out of the mine thing, the mine bed it was under reclamation, we are still under consideration for this project. 1 of 3 sites still under consideration. But that company wanted to move quickly. They wanted to identify a spot and start getting everything in order. And so that's an idea of what the process is. So it wasn't a 2-week process of gathering information. It was a 10-year process where that industrial park was converted from a mine site to an industrial park and moved forward from there. So just be aware, it takes a long time for these things to happen, which is why this is a very urgent topic, because we have sites that are potentially going to be coming available in the near future. And if we don't start on that transition, then in 5 and 10 years, when those big industrial projects are coming, we won't have a site ready for them. There are a lot of valuable assets at these parks. I think you already identified that: water, power, buildings, rail, natural gas, other infrastructure that costs hundreds of millions of dollars to put into place. The issue isn't converting them into industrial sites. The issue is the liability. Who takes care of that? I think there's a very positive incentive there for the companies that currently control those sites to divest themselves of that liability. I think there's a very positive opportunity there for the state, for the counties, for economic developments, for private businesses to not assume that liability, but to assume that asset, and along with that asset, that liability. Those are huge assets to the state that need to be utilized.
And I did hear it mentioned that how are we going to maintain those sites? We don't want to just maintain those sites. We want to improve those sites, make them better, more attractive to all sorts of large industrial projects. When Jim Ford and his partner started the Fort Union project, they did not have a tenant lined up. I noticed in the information that the DEQ provided, they said if you have a viable future for that, then it makes it an easy process. Well, Jim Ford didn't have a viable tenant. He had an idea. He had the willingness to accept that risk and move forward in the hope that they would come. Sometimes the term, if you build it, they will come, gets overused. But if you build it, they will come. And that is proven time and time again. I remember the Lander Tiger Park in the Tiger Business Park in Lander. When they built it, they had no prospective tenants. Nobody was lined up for it. At the Business Council hearings, that was what they were digging for. But they were funded and they built it. And today, if you go to that park, it is absolutely full. If you build it, they will come. If you don't build it, they will never come. We've got to do these things. Those are my points. Hopefully I didn't take too much time. I do have one invitation I'd like to issue to the committee. Back about 5 or 6 years ago, I sat in front of this committee. Chairman Greer was there, and we talked about, at the time, it was the Advanced Carbon Products Innovation Center. Today we call it the Wyoming Innovation Center, and our dream and our hope to build that. We didn't come asking for money. We just came to give the Minerals Committee an update on the project. At the time, it was still a concept. We had received our Business Council grant. We were applying for an EDA grant. That was 5 or 6 years ago. We are having the ribbon cutting on that building, on that facility, on June the 14th. It's built, it's available. We have a couple of tenants lined up. And I guess that's a real quick report of that facility, but June the 14th, starting at 11 o'clock in the morning, we're going to provide tours and information about the facility. Governor Gordon won't be there. He's having a grandchild that day. But we're going to have a lot of federal delegates there. Please come. June the 14th. We'd love to see you there. I'd be happy to answer any questions or address any other points.
Questions for Mr. Christopherson? Our questions will probably be a little weak because Senator Rothfuss isn't here. Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Christopherson. Any other public comment on repurposing of industrial sites? Any other public comment? Hearing none, we're going to move right on to Agreement State Status Thorium, which I think there's one page in our booklet, page 6.
Mr. Chairman, I can keep this extremely brief.
Bless your heart.
We've been tasked with looking at a feasibility study and contracting that feasibility study to adding source material to the uranium program, which is 11E2 byproduct material from the NRC. The B11 funding, transfer for the funding was completed. So we do have the money in place for that contract. The scope of work, the contract, it is in our legal department for final review and should be issued by May 1st. When I drafted these slides, this slide I was drafting, forecasting where we might be, but to give you a reality, we'll look to have that contract issued by May 1st. And I think important to the committee is the final bullet. We're looking to have that draft study by late July, early August, probably a final study by early in September. And then the final point to this is if it's something the committee does decide based on that feasibility study that you do choose to move forward with, the legislation that would be required is pretty straightforward. I believe it's in Article 20 where we would add behind the 11E2 byproduct, you would add source material so that the governor can write the letter and we can engage the NRC. It should be a pretty straightforward deal. We will certainly have better answers for you on this topic once we have the feasibility study.
And Thompson and Pugsley is a legal firm?
Mr. Chairman, they are, and they are the ones that conducted the 11E2 study for the original uranium program.
Any questions on rare earth? Yep.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and again, this byproduct that we anticipate out of rare earth mining, is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct, and then the scope of the feasibility study, it addresses not only rare earths as being newly mined, but also potentially out of coal or coal ash. So we're looking at rare earths as a whole and any associated radionuclides that might come out of that. And ironically enough, just for clarity here, when you look at processing a source material with rare earths, uranium is a source material, not an 11E2 byproduct material, the way the NRC categorizes it. So you have thorium and uranium as source materials in a rare earth. So that is handled differently than for our ISRs or in situ operations where it's an 11E2 category byproduct material for uranium.
And so, Mr. Chairman, I want to make people clearly understand the reason why we're doing this was to be able to advance the development of rare earth ores. The second component for this committee and the members on here is to understand that our last meeting is going to be at the end of October. And so the timing on this is such that to take the first step was probably going to require the committee to move quickly and be able to take that through the session, knowing that there'd probably be another year with refinement to the legislation. And then as when we did the agreement state status, I fortunately was able to transition over to appropriations during that period of time. So we were able to ensure we had the expertise within the department. So those are just issues that this committee all needs to be aware of as you all move into the next general session. So,
Mr. Chairman, and that's why I was saying, I think then the first step, as we did with the URP program, that is the governor engaging, and that's the one piece we would need probably this go-around. Second go-around is the enabling legislation for source material, probably then a third go-around of refining that to meet the NRC specifics. Yep.
One of we're just kind of talking about thorium, but the other rare earths will come out of that also, won't they? Won't we get all rare earths in that discussion?
Mr. Chairman, we're looking at the radionuclides that we would have to regulate through that program that the NRC does. Right now, for example, if the Upton demonstration plant, they will need an NRC license for source materials, and their primary source materials are thorium and uranium. It would shift that to the state, like the uranium recovery program, where we would then manage the source materials, those specific source materials that are those radionuclides regulated by the NRC. So we wouldn't be necessarily regulating the rare earths. We're regulating the radionuclides that are the source material offstream of the rare earths, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. Other questions? Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to back up really quick. The feasibility study is investigating the feasibility of the state taking on that regulatory authority, correct? Is there any business plan element to the feasibility study, or how the actual, how that looks on the ground, or is it just studying the agency itself?
Mr. Chairman, it's looking at just like the stand-up of the uranium program, where we looked at what will it take for the state of Wyoming to amend their agreement status to take on source material, to regulate those materials through the state.
Yes.
it's more of a legal opinion in review of our statutes and the federal statutes, and so don't confuse it with the feasibility study that we were talking about earlier. It's more of a legal review, generally stating.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that's correct. It's can we actually take on this sliver of source material and regulate that. Maybe to better answer Representative Gray's question is it will look at, do we have to add FTE, and if so, how many, and what will that take, and who's going to pay for what components of this, and what does that all look like? That's all part of that study.
Other questions for Kyle? Other question? Yeah, one here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kyle, just so I'm clear, so if I have a client that wants to come in and mine uranium and possibly rare earth, currently in Wyoming, what you're saying is in Wyoming, you can regulate the uranium portion of it, but the feds will have the regulatory component on the rare earths currently. Is that what the current situation is?
No, Mr. Chairman and Senator Beitman, thanks for that question because it's a really important question. Right now, we regulate what's called mining and milling and 11E2 byproduct material, and that's uranium, okay? And that was at a considerable savings to the industry. That's a fee-based program that industry said, we believe the state can do it faster, better, and cheaper than the NRC, bottom line. Okay, and that's proven to be true. Rare Earths has approached us with, we would like to do the same, but the way that the NRC categorizes their offstream from their milling, it's thorium and uranium are source materials. So we would be now regulating rare earths for source materials, or radionuclide source materials specifically, and that would be added to or amended to the existing program. Does that help?
Yes, Representative.
Mr. Chairman, may I add some information? May I add some information?
I don't know if you can or not.
Okay. Well, then I will, and you can
We'll
stop
see.
me.
We'll see.
Just for everyone's understanding, rare earths themselves are not radioactive. It's the geology brings with it the radionuclides, in this case, in Wyoming, generally uranium and thorium. To possess those, and they're a byproduct, they're a leftover from the processing, you have to have an NRC license to possess them in the quantities that will come back. And that's what this does, is to say, can the state, is it feasible, is it economic for the state to be the regulator, as we currently do for uranium mining, for those byproduct materials, not rare earths. I mean, there are a lot of rare earths that are around that are not, they do not come back with radionuclides. The other thing this will do also is for other things besides rare earths. As Mr. Wentland said, for coal, we're looking at pulling rare earths from coal. Most people don't realize in the partings above and below the coal, there is an amount of radionuclides already there. That again, if you have them in possession, you have to have a license. So that's the difference. The rare earths themselves are not radioactive. It's the byproducts from the processing that now make the company holding those, they have to have a license to hold those until they can either sell them, dispose of them, whatever. That's what this is doing. Thank you, Mr.
That was a
Chairman.
very good explanation, Representative Burkhart. Thank you. Yeah,
Mr. Chairman, Representative Burkhart, thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Any other comments or questions? Hearing none, thank you. Thank you for your input. We'll look forward to hearing from you in October. Next order of business is, did we have some public comment on that subject? No public comment on that subject? We'll close public comment then. On to industrial siting, and I believe LSO has an overview. It's the last packet of your book, I think, is where the overview is.
Yep, and Mr. Chairman, I'll jump in. You have a topic summary on industrial siting. It's 8-05 on the online materials. I'm just going to hit a couple of highlights with this. Industrial Development Information and Siting Act was enacted in 1975. The general purpose is really to identify and address impacts associated with industrial development. The act created an industrial siting council that reviews applications for permits for the construction of industrial facilities. The act, this is one of the notable points to this. This is in 3511-102A7. The act defines what an industrial facility is for purposes of determining whether a facility would be subject to the act. If a facility does not satisfy that or does not fall within that definition in 3511-102, the act would not apply to that facility. So it includes industrial facilities with an estimated construction cost of $96 million. That figure was set in statute a number of years ago and must be adjusted annually. I believe the current figure is approximately $230 or $231 million for that monetary threshold of a facility that would be subject to the Industrial Siting Act. It also includes the following facilities without regard to cost: commercial waste incineration facilities, commercial incineration facilities for hazardous waste, commercial radioactive waste management facilities. Before July 1, 1999, it also included overburden or waste rock disposal facilities. And then more recent additions to the act subject wind facilities with at least 20 turbines to the provisions of the Industrial Siting Act. Any solar or wind facility that a county refers to the Industrial Siting Council for consideration. So if the county would otherwise have jurisdiction of that facility but wants the Industrial Siting Council to review it, a county may refer that facility to the council for consideration. And then finally, solar facilities with either a 30 megawatt capacity or a solar facility that encompasses at least 100 acres. The Industrial Siting Council consists of 7 members. They must be Wyoming residents. They serve 6-year terms, and they must be confirmed by the Senate. Their duties are varied, including rule promulgation and then specific rules associated with particular facilities. So for example, the council is required to set rules for financial assurance requirements for wind and solar facilities. The act also specifies the application process for a permit for an industrial facility. There's various information that an applicant must submit to the council for review. There's requirements for state agencies to provide information regarding estimated impacts of those facilities and regulating or managing or mitigating those impacts. A hearing must be held on the application, and then the council must complete findings, issue an opinion, and then grant or deny the application. The act provides when the council must grant an application. And if the council determines all of the following, then they're required to grant that permit. The facility must comply with all applicable law. It cannot pose a threat of serious injury to the environment or to the social or economic condition or inhabitants in the affected area. The facility cannot substantially impair the health, safety, or welfare of the inhabitants in the area of the facility. And then and the applicant must have sufficient financial resources for the decommissioning and reclamation that would be associated with the facility. And then also for wind and solar, those applicants must also show the financial resources to operate those facilities. Review of decisions made by the Industrial Siting Council would be through a petition of review through the district court. And then after a permit is issued by the Industrial Siting Council, no state, regional agency, or local government can require any further approval except that the Department of Environmental Quality and the Public Service Commission still would retain authority to regulate that facility under the provisions of statute that they have jurisdiction over. The act also provides a process for a waiver request whereby a proposed applicant for a facility could seek a waiver of the act's application provisions and certain portions of that process. They must submit generally the same information. That waiver determination happens on a more expedited timeline and also includes an informal meeting that the Department of Environmental Quality must hold in the affected community. There would still be a public hearing within a shorter timeline. And then similarly, statute specifies the conditions that if an applicant meets those for a waiver, the council must grant the waiver request. The facility cannot produce an unacceptable environmental, social, or economic impact. The applicant has discussed the proposed facility with all local governments that are potentially affected. The proposed facility must comply with all local ordinances and land use plans, and then similar financial resource requirements that have to be proven. Statute does provide that no waiver can be granted if 2 or more local governments are not satisfied that the facility represents an acceptable impact. So part of the waiver process would be the consultation with local governments regarding the impacts and whether those entities find those impacts acceptable. The Act also specifies post-permit duties for the Industrial Siting Council and DEQ. There are specific exemptions from certain portions of the Act. So, for example, non-mineral processing facilities in existing industrial parks are exempt from the payment of fees and certification procedures, but must still provide certain application information. State and local governments similarly are exempt from the Act, but must provide basic application information to the council. The construction, operation, and maintenance of certain electrical systems, drilling systems, and pipelines are exempt. And then, Mr. Chairman, the final thing I'll mention, I think the committee is well aware of 2022 House Bill 47, which changed the process by which local impact assistance payments are calculated. That changed the calculation from a maximum of 2.76% of the total estimated material cost of the facility to a 3-tiered system where the maximum allowable percentage for an impact assistance payment range between 1.5% and 2.25%, depending on the estimated materials cost. So certain thresholds would get you in a certain maximum percentage. For the lowest tier, those facilities that have estimated material costs between $0 and $350 million, the council is able to go up to 2.76% if it specifically finds that 2.25% is insufficient to mitigate the impacts. That bill also clarified that in determining the distribution ratio among affected entities, the Industrial Siting Council can consider the extended location of unmitigated impacts, the populations of the affected communities, disproportionate impacts in smaller communities, and then any other equitable factor that the council identifies. Orders for payments must include specific findings of fact detailing the basis for the total dollar amount determination. The bill also added an annual reporting requirement for entities that receive these payments and how they expend those payments, and then also defined unmitigated impact for purposes of making those. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for questions.
Any questions for Brian? Yes, Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I got a couple questions. Mr. Fuller, you did a great job on this. Appreciate your memo. One thing that's unclear to me, and maybe we have gone through it and I'm just forgetting, is does the statute specify how many shots they get at this, the local government, for impact assistance payments? Is it continuous through the life of the project? Does it specify a number of times they can go back, or is it just interminable?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, I'm not sure that question's directly answered. What is specified now, though, through House Bill 47 is that in the definition of unmitigated impact, it excludes expenses for which a county, city, or town previously received an impact assistance payment. There is an exception to that, though. If the county or city or town can demonstrate that the expenses are new or ongoing, then that would not be excluded under that definition.
Follow-up?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have one other one. How does the appropriation work? I think the way they do it is they just have a huge appropriation every time for the council that usually is reverted a portion of it back, and then they get reports to appropriations. But is that how they do it, or is it a little bit different? Is it just an ongoing basis, maybe?
You know, Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, I'm not 100% sure on the mechanics, but the statute pulls this directly from, the statute that these are in the distribution statutes for the sales and use taxes. So my understanding is it would come directly from, when those are distributed by the Department of Revenue, this would be part of that distribution.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
And again, I'll be like Mr. Fuller and say I'm not, but it's just basically, it's a diminution in the general revenue. So it's not seen as an appropriation. It's just a lesser amount of general revenue. Is that much like several, I can think of insurance credits and some things like that. They're the same way, is that they're not a direct appropriation. It's just you have a diminution in the overall gross sales tax that's received. But we can ask Mr. Richards to roll that out if you'd like.
Any other questions? Any other questions for Mr. Fuller? Yes. Representative Sherwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm happy to take this offline if we don't know today. Do we have a sense of how many choose to go through the standard application process versus the waiver process? Thank you.
Maybe we need to refer that to somebody else.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think DEQ can answer that. I think we were told in earlier testimony before our committee is that the waiver process shouldn't even be in statute, it's waste of paper, but we'll let the department answer that.
All right. No other questions? Senator Rothfuss, no questions? Oh, bless your heart. Okay, we'll move on to the department on industrial siting. And we have some industrial siting guys here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Alan Edwards. I came back on board with DEQ Monday of last week, and I currently serve as the administrator of the Industrial Siting Division. And in my current capacity, I'm also assisting the director in a deputy role. So I'll be serving two roles again. As such, I don't have a detailed background right now on industrial siting and all the requirements, but I do have some general understanding. For the most part in the presentation, I'll just turn that over to Kimber, who has a lot of experience in this area. But I would like to just touch on a couple of points to supplement the LSO report. One, at the first quarter meeting of the council, the threshold for jurisdiction was actually changed. That threshold is now 253.9 million. So that is the number that would be applied. In addition, as was noted, but I know in the fact sheet it explains that, pipelines are not jurisdictional with the exception of coal slurry pipelines. And I guess that's a remnant of the 1970s proposal. So, and I can answer some of the questions, or we can, but if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask Kimber to just do a quick walkthrough of our presentation. We won't duplicate some of the items that were specifically referenced, but if she walks through, she can give you some of the highlights of when certain of the changes occurred that now relate to our activities.
Okay.
Thank you.
Kimber?
Chairman, thanks for having me today. My name's Kimber Wickman. I'm Management Services Administrator with DEQ. I had the privilege of being in industrial siting for 8 years prior to my position now. So I am familiar with working with the counties and local governments through this process, as well as with the applicants. We're going to go over, I outlined on the topics page kind of the things we're going to touch upon. If you have questions along the way, I'm happy to take a deeper dive into these. I'm really letting you guide the conversation. The next slide, slide 3 with the history. Again, I know LSO did a great job at capturing this. Industrial siting started in 1975. It was actually its own department under the governor's office, and it had 8 full-time employees. It was really to provide a mechanism where there was no other permitting involved to protect the economic, social, and environmental conditions for these large-scale projects that tended to bring in a very large-scale construction workforce that many times would double the size of a community. And that could really stretch the services during that time, the social services, the police services, things like that. So that's where this came to be. The other item it did is it gave applicants some certainty on when they could construct and start their investment in the state. And what I mean by that is no other local entity could put other requirements on the company once they received an industrial siting permit. And as LSO pointed out, the only exception to that was DEQ would continue to monitor, as well as the Public Service Commission for some of those projects. What also is unique to know in those times is the reason why it came about is there was the Gillette syndrome, and they also called it, I believe, the Riverton syndrome, or the Rock Springs syndrome in the early 1970s, late 1960s. What happened when these large-scale industrial projects came in is there was severe overcrowding. There was a lot of family violence. They noticed a huge uptick in prostitution, and there could be a lot of corruption and political circles as well, and that's why they wanted, the state as a whole wanted to take some control over this and try to get some mitigation efforts in place so they didn't have to experience that pain. And what happened with the mitigation that took place and was required as part of this process, it was at that time paid by the company or the applicant. That changed in 1992. Impact assistance payments became distributed through the sales and use tax. And it also became a division under DEQ. And right now we have 1.5 full-time employees. And currently impact assistance is paid, like I said, by the sales and use tax. There are some requirements in the revenue statutes that say certain taxes have to be collected by the counties to be eligible to get the impact assistance, and I believe that's the 5th penny tax they have to be collecting at the time. And the state's portion of that is what is then offered back in impact assistance. There's no questions on that. I'll go on to the...
Yeah, I have a question. You have 8 FTE and then 1.5 additional?
No,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
Mr. Chairman. What happened in 1975 when it was first created, there were 8 FTE in the governor's office that were dedicated to industrial siting. Now today in DEQ, there is just 1.5 FTE towards that. Next slide, for the Industrial Siting Development Information and Siting Act. It's actually 19 statutes, 35, 12, 101 through 119, and I've just summarized them here. I'm not going to go through all of them. I did want to touch on just a few of them for discussion sakes today, and they're the ones that are underlined. So 104 is the creation of the Industrial Siting Council. This is different from the EQC. It's specific to industrial siting. It's a 7-member council. Each member has a 6-year term commitment. They are appointed by the governor, and they are confirmed by the Senate. The other item I wanted to point out, which we talked about briefly, was the 107 process. It's called the waiver to permit application. That's kind of a misconception in the name. It's not a waiver. They do have to go through certain items. It's a truncated permitting process. It takes 90 days instead of the 135 days. But the main difference is the 19 state agencies are not contacted through that process at all. It is not used very often, and it is something I know that has been up for discussion of something that may be removed or may be considered for removal because it has not been used. The 109 process is the actual application for permit, is the full process. It takes 135 days from the point we get the application to the point the decision is offered. And that clock does not restart anywhere along the way. So as soon as we get the application, we have to have a hearing within 90 days. And I believe that process is documented in the document from LSO you received today. The other item I want to discuss on this page was the 111 statute, and that's the parties to the permit proceeding. Basically, the ones that are eligible to be parties in the contested case proceeding are the local governments identified as primarily affected, and that's set by the director. Also, any landowners, affected landowners that are also in the area primarily affected, and any nonprofit organizations that have a Wyoming chapter are allowed to be a party as well to the proceeding. And why that is also important is because only those parties are able to appeal the decision then in the 109 process. Any questions on that one? We'll move on to slide 5. These are not the only changes, but they seem to be the rather significant ones that come up for discussion quite a bit. 2010 is when wind was added to the Industrial Siting Act, and at that time it was 30 turbines that would trigger jurisdiction. Also, what came under that change was that a reclamation bond is required for wind. In 2015, Enrolled Act 71, it modified the impact assistance distribution, and it changed it to where it had that cap of 2.76% of the estimated material costs. In 2020, it added commercial solar, and what triggered that is the 30 megawatts or more of electric generation by solar, or a surface disturbance of 100 acres or more. At that same time in 2020, the jurisdiction for wind was lowered to 20 turbines, and both those require bonds. So none of the other industrial facilities do, but wind and solar do at this time. 2022, as you're well familiar, we had another change to the impact assistance, and it went to this tiered structure, which you're all familiar with. Any questions on? Okay. What's our most common question are the triggers for jurisdiction, which we've outlined on this page. Most of our projects that are not, of course, wind or solar are triggered by the estimated material costs. And as Mr. Edwards indicated, that currently is at $253.9 million. We do ask that if they're within 80% of that cost, they give us some general information about their project, just so as other projects come in, we're aware of that workforce. And what those elements primarily are is when they would start construction, how many workers they would have in the area at the peak by quarter. So we take those into consideration as we receive any other applications. We've talked about the wind and solar triggers, and then there's a few others there, such as commercial incineration, and incineration also of hazardous materials. And the last one is commercial radioactive, but we haven't had those today. The other common question we get is on the next slide, exemptions. These are what projects can take place and they will not trigger our process, nor will we ask for additional information. Electrical transmission lines that are under 160,000 volts. State and local government units, we would ask them too to let us know if they have a larger project, that we'd be aware of their workforce and give us those totals. So if we get an application, we would take the housing and those things into consideration as we considered the new project. And then of course, oil and gas drilling, producing, and gas well-filled activities are all exempt as well. Questions on those?
I have a question on that.
Sure.
What do you know why we would not, well, we accept coal slurry pipelines? Why would that come under jurisdiction if the other pipelines don't?
Mr. Chairman, I can say in just doing my research that it was very specific to exempt oil and gas at the time in 1975 when it was written. And I know that was a big point of conversation because it came up in the 1974 legislative session. And when it came back in 1975,
they really only wanted the oil and gas exception. So that's all I could offer as to why. It was very pointed towards oil and gas at the time.
Okay, thank you.
Oh,
Yes.
Go ahead.
This exception, and going back to 2011, 2012, or this series, when we had the coal bed methane development in Campbell, Johnson, Sheridan County, was a topic of discussion. There was significant impacts, but they were smaller pods scattered throughout. The discussion also came back up when we saw the heavy impacts on oil and gas development in Converse County and southern Campbell County as well, but could never really find, because you have, instead of one basic point of industry versus multiple, especially coal bed methane, maybe hundreds of producers. It was difficult to get your arms around, but the impacts were still all the same in those areas. But so those discussions have gone on over the years. I'm sure there'll be more.
Representative Burkhardt.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some of us probably remember the coal slurry pipeline issue. Became very, very controversial with a lot of opposition, and I think that's where some of that comes from on the coal slurry. And right now, I wish they would have built it.
Senator Wassberger.
Well, thank you, Senator. The real issue on the coal slurry pipeline was the amount of water that it was going to use, and the fact that that water wasn't going to be returned to Wyoming. It was all going to be taken from the Madison, I believe. And so the eastern part of the state, specifically landowners, were drastically against that issue, and I believe that's the reason for where we're at today.
I think you're right. I think that was a big issue, but the coal slurry pipeline guys, Frank Odaz was who was heading that up, actually offered to build a return line to bring that water back. And it still couldn't get past. So water was not the only issue there. There seems to be another issue, and maybe had to do with a hard rail piece. So anyway, all right, thank you. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, what happens on the ground if a business doesn't think their project is going to hit the 254 million cap or whatever it is that year, but you do? I mean, the way the statute reads is it doesn't fit into the definition, I don't think. I mean, do they just proceed, or do you file some sort of contesting motion or something? What happens if they don't think they hit it?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, there are some pretty heavy repercussions if they do proceed and don't come talk to the division. There's a fine of $10,000 per day for operating without a permit. And then also there can be jail time up to 1 year. But we would have to then reach out to the company and probably take those actions. We've never had to do that, but I know there is persuasive ways to get them to come in and at least have the conversation.
Jail time for their legislative representative. Go ahead.
Alan, do you
Go
have-
ahead. Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I think it would be important to note that, prior to the time and during excuse me, let me back up a second. As Kimber indicated, if they're within 80% of what that threshold would be, they are asked to come in with all their data to show what their cost estimates are. At that point, the department has the time and the ability to work with the company, define the costs, and make sure there's a generally stated understanding of what those costs are and where they apply. So while the enforcement would be something that would come in the end if they proceed without a permit when they need one, those discussions will occur during that permit review process. Because our interest is to make sure that if they meet the threshold, they apply. but to have a understanding and all the parties have the opportunity to be aware of what's happening. So it's proactive with the other option only if necessary.
Okay, good. Excuse me just a minute. I need to introduce Representative Harshman. He came across the street to join us. Thanks for joining us, Representative Harshman. All right. Oh, you got another question? Oh, okay, excuse me.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. How does this work the opposite way? Because of the unique structure of Wyoming's statute, that the payments come out of the sales and use tax, not from anything from the business itself. There actually may be an incentive for them to increase their estimate to trigger the statute, which could build goodwill with the local community where they want to cite their project. Do you ever downgrade their estimate if maybe it's a little bit hot one side towards the upside? Thank you.
Go ahead. See if you can answer that.
Mr. Chairman, I think I understand better the question in general, and it is, there is a jurisdictional meeting that has to take place, and at that meeting, they're required to provide the estimated material costs at that meeting. And that's where jurisdiction is determined, or a certificate of insufficient jurisdiction is determined. I would say there's no motivation from the industrial siting division to encourage a permit if it's not needed. And I've not talked with an applicant that wanted to go through the process if it wasn't needed, but we have not changed the estimate when it comes in.
Okay. Go ahead.
The next slide, slide 8, kind of gives you an overview of what's on the radar for industrial siting over the next year. We are anticipating 3 applications, 2 which will come in this year that we already have timelines for. That is Anacline Wind in Natrona County. We're expecting that one in July, and Dyna Solar in Natrona County, which we're expecting in August. Cheyenne South Solar, we're also expecting, but they haven't given us a specific time frame. And the other projects we've had jurisdictional meetings on, and we know there will be jurisdiction, are Pacific and Atlantic Soda, which is Trona, and Raven Solar. And I've listed the counties there. Just as general information, I thought the Minerals Committee might be interested to see how many permits to date have been issued. That's 67 there, and of those, 22 have been wind. And then I thought it might also be of interest of how many megawatts from wind and solar have been approved to date, and that is the second one, the second table there that I've identified for you.
Question. Oh, Representative Sherwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hearkening back to the conversation about that review of costs. So when you look at the estimated construction materials that the company brings forth, at that time, do you consider or determine how much will be purchased in state versus out of state, or how much is purchased in the county where the project is happening versus in another community? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Chairman, what I can tell you is not to the level you're saying. What we are required to make sure happens is that the items are delivered and taken, what's the title for? Where you pay tax on them? Yeah, the delivery is taken at the project site. So in that county where the footprint's at, that's where the delivery has to take place, and that's where the tax is then charged on those. But if they are bought in state, no, that is not a current requirement. What is in their application is to say how many workers will be from Wyoming, and that we try to get, I think around 90% is the goal with workforce services. And they do have to show, once they have a permit, part of their monitoring process is to show on a quarterly basis that their contractors and subcontractors are hiring through the workforce management
service office in those locations, and how many of those workers actually then are from Wyoming.
Follow? No? Other questions? Yes. Representative Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Wickman, with the new HB 47 that goes into effect in July, there's a reportability structure in there for transparency. So every year, the counties and municipalities will have to report how the money is actually being spent. Do you see this as much of a burden upon the upon the DQ and or much of a burden upon the counties and municipalities for that annual report?
I'll turn this over to Mr. Edwards.
Mr. Chairman, the bottom line is I was not directly involved in the discussions. Kimber was peripherally. I know that that condition was added, but also I know Director Parfit was directly involved in all those discussions. Having picked up on that before I came, that is a particular topic I need to dive down on with the director to see what the discussions were regarding what would be required and how much data. Because that really drives, I believe, to your point, how much of a burden. Because the other related question is, once the report is submitted, was there an expectation of what the department would do with it? Those are discussions I was not party to, and I would need that background from the director. So I'm not trying to be evasive, but I understand there's some underlying basic issues that I would need to be aware of.
Follow up? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Edwards, could we get a follow-up a year from now? And could you tell us how that is proceeding and what, if any, difficulties you ensue or foresee or are having at that time? And whether it's being an effective tool in your toolbox?
Mr. Chairman, I would expect that sort of a request to come. So as our approach to that, we would be looking ahead at anticipating how to report out what was received and when. Because, one of the real basic questions too is there's an annual report. Is that based on their anniversary? Is that based upon, the fiscal year? So, but I do anticipate that there would be a request for information that would come out of the receipt of those reports.
That's optimistic, thinking you're going to get a report in a year. Yeah, question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is, you in the slide 8, you show the number of permits issued. Can you talk a little bit about the permits over time that have been denied and what types of projects they were? How many permits have been denied? Is it a common practice? Is it not very common? And the types of projects.
Anybody who wants to answer?
Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer that. There has not been a permit denied. What I can say is there have been permits that expired, so they didn't get built within the 3 years and they didn't do an amendment. And so then the permit itself expires. We've had that happen with 2 wind projects and a couple other projects. It's not very common because usually of this size, they usually move forward.
Other questions? Other questions? Yes, you go ahead. All right, go ahead.
Mr.
Representative
Chairman,
Gray.
one thing I think that it would be good at, we should become really experts on for the body on what the totals here are. So what are the totals the last couple years? Because I didn't see that in any of the presentations and of what the amounts dispersed total were.
Go ahead.
Chairman, I know this is a report we give to Don Richards annually when he does his Craig report, so we'd be happy to share that.
You'll get it when your Craig report comes out, I guess. Okay. Representative Greer.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Part of this being, it's more of a comment for the committee, but there will be a question at the end for you. Is to understand industrial siting and its history. We see it crop up in our meetings from time to time with issues, but one of the discussions, if this committee will recall last August, was the issue of how this is structured in Wyoming. And, why is it that the state is covering these unmitigated impacts? Well, the reason the state is to try to make the locals whole because they're the ones feeling that impact. And, but, prior to 92, industry paid for these unmitigated impacts. So this is part of the question. So the Industrial Siting Council is a process for very large projects to make sure that social fabric doesn't fold up and then the underlying infrastructure within an area holds up until such time as the tax base can catch up and move forward. I think that's a fair statement. Is our system of how we do this right now, of the state paying it, better or worse in terms of how industry looks at the projects than having industry pay for these unmitigated impacts and then offering a tax break or a tax incentive as part of the economic development? I think these are the questions we should be asking ourselves. When an industry comes in and they go into another state, do they expect to have to cover the costs associated with this? Is that in their budget? Is that in what they spread out when they do their internal rate of return analysis? And then how does a tax benefit or break play into that? And these are not things that we've got time to discuss today, but as we roll into our next two meetings, maybe we should be asking ourselves that and looking at, is that the right structure? So getting back to my question, would it affect the ability of the council to make sure the unmitigated impacts are in place if the funding for those impacts came from industry versus from just the state covering those?
Mr. Edwards. Mr. Chairman, I don't have a direct answer to that, but I think the point you might be driving to, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the department, if that requirement was retained with the department to ensure that industry was paying directly those costs, should that be the route it goes, it would seem to me there'd still need to be some sort of application process to define what those impacts are as defined in that application and all the discussions with the project applicant. So no matter what, you'd still have to get to that point. So then the question that arises, which is again where I think you're headed, is how are those impacts tracked? Now, as it is now with the change in this last session, there will be annual reports, which I'm sure is driving towards, tracking and are they covered and how are they covered. I would assume that a similar process would need to be established under that structure, whereby the department would be required to track to ensure those recognized impacts were being addressed. So there would be a change that the department would have to enact, and there'd be requirements that go along with that. It would just be a different focus. But no matter what, those impacts would still need to be recognized to make sure the right and appropriate impacts were being addressed.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, follow up.
So following upon sort of the line that Representative Gray was saying and a few others, in a scenario where industry had to pay for those impacts to the locals, but were able to receive a credit back, right? One more additional step or burden with it. What I think you will find then is the locals and industry will negotiate much harder, especially when you're under the cap, to where it's easy. And that accountability will be held between the locals and industry, much more stringent than anything we could do at a state level. And I just, again, just trying to give people things to get their mind working. I mean, we've really got to look at doing some different things differently, and this is just one that had come up that was discussed. If you recall at our meeting in Laramie, this idea came up last August. So.
Mr. Chairman, just as a
go ahead.
response to that. Again, well, first of all, Todd's probably pulling his hair out that I'm even attempting to ask these or answer these. But, you know, there'd have to be a lot of in-depth discussions. So if the counties in fact negotiated and did that, is there still a need for a tool to help identify what those impacts might be so they have the information and a tool to work with? So there would have to be, I'm assuming, extensive discussions on how to proceed in that direction.
I think the process.
Representative Sherwood, did you have a?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just piggybacking on this, as a historian, I always appreciate the look back and how that influences how we move forward. And so please, if you could elaborate, before 1992, was there a development impact fee in place, something that we would consider where industry pays to mitigate those social impacts? And if there's any backstory on why that changed in 1992, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know the answer to that. I just know that's when in the revenue statute that came to come out of the sales and use.
Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Does the statute have a cap at which, you know, they keep coming back saying there's unmitigated impacts? Is there a point at which it ends, or through the life of the project, can they just keep coming continually as the project continues? Obviously, you have the discretion to evaluate whether it's legitimate or not, but are they able to keep asking infinitely?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, how that works is it's a contested case proceeding where those parties come with exhibits that detail the amount they're asking for. And sometimes they come with a collective agreement signed by all the local governments that detail what each one is asking for. By statute, it can't go over the cap that's in the revenue statute, which now is based on that tiered structure. So if they're under that maximum, they could come back, but they'd have to ask for the council to meet again and discuss it. And those usually take about a quarter to arrange those, so 3 months or so to arrange such a meeting. And it just kind of depends how quickly the construction's going on to consider that. That said, that has not been done while I was with Industrial Siding. Nobody had ever come back after the final decision and asked for more. But I had heard comments from the council saying if they had cut it too close, that they had that opportunity to do so.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The memo lays out this $100,000 application fee, and you're supposed to return what isn't spent. So are you like literally like almost like attorneys kind of tracking your hours on each case so that you can attribute a certain amount to each project? I mean, how do you track, how often do you return a portion of that $100,000, and are you tracking it pretty closely?
Mr. Chairman, yes, we're actually statutorily required, as you said, to do so. So as when an application comes in, the check for that application comes in as well. And we've done an estimate with our accounting team that says how much of that will go towards hearing expenses, towards travel expenses, those sort of things. And we actually have a code assigned to that we charge time to that specific project that we charge time to, we charge copies to, we charge postage to. That hearing gets billed to that one specifically, and yes, it is tracked. And after the first year of operation, that's when our monitoring for industrial siting stops. And at that point, we give a detailed accounting of what all the money for the application has been spent for, and we do return the funds that are left. And yes, often there are significant funds left.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, yes.
Mr. Chairman, if I could make just a couple other follow-on comments. One, the non-jurisdictional process to me has value for the benefit of the potential applicant. They wouldn't be approaching us if they weren't interested in establishing a business and getting something going. So, but there are other permit requirements that they may have to satisfy: water quality, air quality, et cetera. So for them to come and have that early discussion with us, it provides us the opportunity to give them a heads up. You know, have you considered an air quality permit? Do you need that? You know, talk to the agency so that they don't get crosswise later because there's something else that they perhaps weren't aware of. We have companies coming in from out of state who perhaps may not be familiar with all the other requirements. So in a way, that's a means to also help them and provide some assistance. Back to the 107 process, a couple of, just to touch on that again, the title is Waiver of Permit Application. In a way, that's not correct because they still have to make an application. It's just the requirements are different and they're reduced. So in essence, they have to. One of the big distinctions is if they proceed through the Section 107 process, that's done as a hearing in front of the council. If they go through the full 109, that's a contested case. So all the parties have the ability to provide all the relative information for the council to consider in a contested case situation. I think, at least what I understand, is companies may be reluctant to proceed with the 107 process because if at the end there's objections and the permit can't be issued, then their only recourse may be to come back and initiate the 109 process, which resets the clock and builds in then delays for the industry or the applicant. So you got more certainty on one, and so that timing factor and the overlap, I think, would be something they would be very interested in. And for Representative Sherwood, my apologies for interrupting later, but on the historical perspective, the very first two industrial siting permits that were issued were to the Jim Bridger Unit 4 and to the Missouri Basin Power Plant, which are both two large projects, but I know they were the first two through the process in 1976. Just historical perspective.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I think we're done with our questions. I think we've wrapped that up. The next order of business is public comment, but I'm going to put that off till after lunch because I think we got quite a bit of public comment on this subject. So we'll break for lunch now and be back at 1:30 and start with public comment on industrial siting. Thank you.